Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, May 17th, 2023. Today, I'm talking about emergency powers, using states of emergency as a blueprint for tyranny, as I'm wearing the T-shirt, the great quote from John Adams. Back when he was one of the good guys in 1776, he said, "Fear is the foundation of most governments." And that's really what it gets down to. I just, of course, remove the word most from that, and I'd be all about it. So they use states of emergency. They rely on the fear of the people to establish total control. And there's actually been research done some time ago, but there's a really great article that I want to cover on this today, showing that there's basically 8 stages in this script or blueprint for emergency power. But before getting to those 8 stages, I want to start out here with an article just published by John Whitehead over at the Rutherford Institute. And he said every decade or so, the government makes the case for expanding its wartime powers and curtailing the citizenry's freedom. In the war on terrorism, war on drugs, war on communism, war on foreigners, war on extremism, war on dissidents, war on peace activists, war on anti-government speech, etc. And all, of course, for the sake of national security. And as expected, the American people fall in line. A vast majority, in fact, many of them are out there begging for more government power. They think the solution to the problems created by the government in the first place is to go to those same people to solve that problem somehow, or they're just clueless about what's going on. Now, the thing is, once they get these new powers for one emergency or another, and over time, if you're like me, it sure seems like the threshold for what qualifies as one of these so-called emergencies keeps getting lower and lower and lower and lower. They don't give those powers back. Sometimes they say the emergency's over and they're going to stop doing the emergency actions or whatever powers that they've claimed, and they really do them behind the scenes. Sometimes they say the emergency's over and they actually stop using the emergency power, but it's still on the books as a precedent for the next time people are afraid, well, they did it a couple decades ago, let's do it again. So I covered this kind of thing in some detail in an episode just last year. Emergency powers are forever. Once any government is allowed to overreach and expand its powers, the genie will never go back in the bottle, at least voluntarily. Hear from Ryan McMaken, or McMacken. I never know if I get his last name pronounced right, but Ryan does great writing over at the Mises Institute, and he said this permanent embrace of emergency power is to be expected. Governments have long used crises as an excuse to expand government power, often with the glowing approval of the electorate. As Robert Higgs has shown in his book Crisis and a Leviathan, everyone should be reading Higgs from time to time, using wars and other crises to permanently expand state power is just standard operating procedure for countless regimes. It's what governments do. And of course, without even talking about the emergency and the fear involved there are so many quotes from the founding generation talking about how governments have a natural tendency to expand in its power. And we know that when the people are afraid and they trust government at the same time, and many people do, no matter what the polls tell you, because ultimately when it gets down to things, when they're afraid, they're thinking, well, I may not like this politician, but I still want him to do something about something, right? And they're always going back, chasing the government down to protect them from someone foreign or domestic, something seen or unseen, something. And F.A. Hayek actually discussed this in Volume 3 of Law, Legislation, and Liberty. It starts out pretty good. He ends up getting a little milquetoast, as Ryan pointed out at Mises Institute, but there's some good bits and pieces here. Hayek said, emergencies, and he put emergencies in scare quotes, which I think is pretty good, have always been the pretext on which the safeguards of individual liberty have been eroded. Think Patriot Act, for example. That's a great example of it. Or lockdowns, for example. And he goes on, now he didn't say that, but they have been eroded. And once they are suspended, it is not difficult for anyone who has assumed such emergency powers to see that the emergency will persist. So it's in there. If they only get to do extra stuff, the sociopaths get to exercise more power because of an emergency, they're happy to see emergencies go on and on and on. And in that episode from last September, Emergency Powers Are Forever, and a bunch of other episodes, I've often cited John Dickinson in his 9th letter from a farmer in Pennsylvania in 1767. These were a series of documents in response to the hated Townshend Acts, and they were the most widely read documents on American liberty up until publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in 1776. This was a widely read and widely appreciated viewpoint. And Dickinson, at the end of his 9th letter, this is again written in 1767, he gave an example of how this type of an emergency mindset, handing over power for one emergency only, sets the precedent for total tyranny. It's a long passage, but let me read it out to you. It closed it out. Spain was once free. Their Cortes resembled our parliaments. No money could be raised on the subject without their consent. That was, for many, the definition of what freedom was. If you didn't, as long as you could consent to things, freedom was based in consent. Anyways, Dickinson goes on. One of their kings, having received a grant from them to maintain a war against the Moors, decided that if the sum which they had given should not be sufficient, he might be allowed for that emergency only. And Dickinson highlight, if you're reading along online here, or you're looking in the show notes, I'll mention that in just a moment, where you can find links to these articles and source documents that I'm mentioning here in this episode. Or if you're watching on the video, you can see that it's highlighted in italics. And in the original, Dickinson highlighted it as well. He might be allowed for that emergency only. That's always the argument of a tyrant. Oh, this is a crazy situation. We know that the structure of the system is supposed to be a certain way, but I know we got to just set that aside just for a month or just 2 more weeks to slow it down, right? Just to stop the Moors, whatever it may be, but for that emergency only. And he asked, well, if I don't have enough money for that emergency only, can I raise more money without assembling the Cortes? So they had this situation where the king could not get any money from the people unless the representatives of the people approved it. But they weren't always in session 24/7, 365, like pretty much a lot of them are today. Now, on the state level, that's a little different. But at least on the national level, and in some states like here in California, in Ohio, and a few other places, they do meet year-round just about. And they had this system where they couldn't get money. And he's like, well, of course, there's a war, because war is one of those places, as we'll hear in just a moment, where it sets the stage for the germ of every other attack on liberty. And this is one of the ways they do that. It becomes a situation where people are afraid and they're looking to the government to protect them, and they will allow them to have extra powers, and they'll think that the people that have that power will just use it one time. And even if that person is out of office later on, or not a king later on, someone else will claim the authority to use that same power for their version of it. And they'll always keep lowering the standards for what qualifies as an emergency. And that's what Dickinson said happened in Spain. He said the request was violently opposed by the best and wisest men in the assembly. It was, however, complied with by the votes of a majority. And this single concession was a precedent for other concessions of the like kind, until at last the crown obtained a general power of raising money in cases of necessity. So it changed from, they could only have it with consent, to, well, you don't need consent if it's an emergency because we trust the king to protect us in crazy situations, to eventually just whatever they decide was necessary. And that's very similar to what we saw happen right at the beginning of the Republic after ratification of the Constitution. We were told that the word necessary meant necessary in necessary and proper. They could only do stuff that was absolutely necessary to carrying out the foregoing powers. And suddenly, over just a period of just a few years, when Hamilton wanted to institute a national bank, he made the claim that, well, necessary just means convenient. Then John Marshall, a few years later, adopted the Hamiltonian position of convenience. So necessity gets changed into convenience pretty quickly, and it keeps getting worse. And Dickinson summed it up with this: from that period, the Cortes ceased to be useful. The people ceased to be free. It was the moment, not the moment where the government was attacking their liberty at all times, but the moment that the people allowed the government to determine the extent of its own power. If the government gets to decide what is and what isn't an emergency, and when the limits of their authority apply or don't apply, you shouldn't be surprised when government eventually has unlimited power, even if they're not exercising it constantly. At some point in the future, there will be a fear-based situation where they're going to say, well, look at the precedent we have from the past, and a future generation will look at us, and they are going to be pissed off for what we've allowed. And we should have the same mentality for those before us. But anyways, back to John Whitehead. He said, once the government acquires, and this is his version of it, I think this was just published this week, once the government acquires and uses additional powers to spy on its citizens, to carry out surveillance, to transform its police forces into extensions of the police, to seize taxpayer funds, to wage endless wars, to censor and silence dissidents, to identify potential troublemakers, to detain citizens without due process, it does not voluntarily relinquish them. And I will link to this article by Whitehead. I'm going to link to the Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, #9 by John Dickinson, plus Hayek, McMacken, episodes, and a bunch of other stuff that I've got coming up, including the article on the 8 stages of the emergency script. I'm not sure if the author here, she's calling it the script for tyranny, but that's the way I read it. So it's interesting research in what she's analyzing has happened around the world. Now, the founders, when they were actually looking to set up a system, they didn't just look at the history of the colonies. They had to understand human nature. They recognized that human nature was important to understand. And if a certain situation was one way in 50 other countries throughout history, and you had the same situation here, you're going to have the same results. So it's important to study world history as well, not just our own. So we've got a big process ahead of us, a big task, really. So 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty is where I will link to all the stuff that I'm mentioning. That way, when you're like, Bolden, I want to find that article, I want to find that episode, where is it? I don't want to Google it, I don't want to start page it, whatever, or I can't find it, the search results, you're being suppressed. You'll be able to find it at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, where I publish a blog post about 1 to 2 hours after the live stream is done, maybe a little bit later today, because I'll have to step out pretty quickly. And I do want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. I appreciate you guys being here. There's RC Andrews. Good to see you, buddy. Been a while since I saw you on the live stream. Kirk Morrison, hope you're doing well today. Sharon I'm not sure where Sharon is, but I appreciate you being here. There's Haji. Sharon liked the sociopaths. I mean, I'm probably being a little soft on him, but I think it's true. I don't think anyone who really is drawn to a position of power in the largest government in the history of the world, there's something screwed up there. If they're not just trying to put a message out there and then they get lucky and get in, they get to put that message out there. Now, a lot of people think that their favorite team member is always one of the good guys. I don't really think there really are any in there, so that's just a side thought. But Richard Banks, good to see you as well. Dixie Strong, Lawrence Smith, John, and everyone else. I know Tyler B., good to see you, buddy. I know I'm skipping over a few people, and I apologize for that. I'll try to see if I can get back to some comments or questions either later in the episode or later today or tomorrow. You can also email me at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Anyway, so we're talking about emergency power, and what I really wanted to get to was this great article over at the Balkanization, Balkan blog, Jack Balkan's blog spot. This is not a site I recommend very often, but I do read it very regularly. It's generally got very opposing views of constitutionalism than what I would share with you here. So if you want to see what the other side is basically saying, this is where to go. But here, this article by Kim Lane, I think it's Shepala. I apologize, Kim, if I get your name wrong. She's got an article or a blog here, a guest post here, in what she calls the emergency script. The script, basically a study that they had done over how they used emergency power in a bunch of countries over a long period of time. And she saw this kind of consistent trend of what we get. And some of it was warned exactly by the founders as well. And I'll kind of sparsely populate some thoughts on that as well. But to start out, number one is executive centralization, centralization of power. Instead of decentralizing and allowing different people to have different approaches in different areas, they want a one-size-fits-all solution, and it's one dude with that authority, or one person, whoever. And she writes, in the first step of the emergency script, power is centralized in the executive. But this does not mean that executives typically grab power away from parliaments and courts in one obvious move. They don't just go and just seize power. A lot of times it's just thrown at them. And they're, of course, being the sociopaths that they are in that type of position of power, they'll gladly use it. That's my take on it. She said, while there are occasionally abrupt takeovers of power by executives in emergencies, more typically the other branches of government collude in their own marginalization or fail to act decisively to constrain executive centralization. I think of a great example, as I mentioned, I hadn't thought of including it in the show notes, but I think war powers in the United States has been a great example of this. And war, of course, is one of the great emergencies where people are willing to give government more and more power. James Madison warned that's exactly what would happen. And of course, he warned that we'd get more power in the executive. I'll get to that in a moment. But one way we've seen this really play out, Congress, in and of itself, is the only branch of the federal government that can make a decision of whether or not the country is going to be at war or peace. They're the only one that can declare war. But what they've done for decades, for basically all of our lives, is they've transferred that power to the executive branch. Maybe they're afraid. Maybe they don't want to take responsibility. Maybe they're not as sociopathic, but they probably are. But they're just happy to hand that off to the executive. And then the executive makes the decision. And that's a great example of how I think what Kim is saying here, the other branches typically collude in their own marginalization. This happens all the time. Now, here to James Madison, his political observations, April 20th, 1795. This will also be linked to in the show notes. You should read this passage in full. I've just got a couple of short clips here. He said, of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded. Why? Because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. And I'm going to skip over a section I always quote, but he points out that executive power, war is an emergency state in many situations, not emergency in the way that governments use it today. Politicians, when they say the word emergency, I mean, I can have an emergency, and I've had some if I ate the wrong thing, for example. We all have them. We use the words in different ways. When government tells us it's an emergency, what they're telling us is they have emergency power. The limits on their power don't qualify anymore. Now, I'm not referencing war in that way at all, because still, there is no emergency clause in the Constitution. They still are limited in what they're authorized to do. But Madison recognized that no matter what limits you give government, they tend to kind of cross the line during war. He said, in war, too, the discretionary power of the executive is extended. Its influence in dealing out offices, honors, and emoluments is multiplied, and all the means of seducing the minds are added to those of subduing the force of the people. So power centralized in the executive branch. Number 2 is militarization. And Kim Lane Shepula says, once the other branches have been marginalized enough for the executive to operate alone, and wow, we see that happen all the time. How many times do you hear whatever team is in charge, if you don't get what you want from the legislature, well, maybe there's a way that the executive branch can just do this by executive order. We hear this on the debt ceiling. Suddenly, they can just raise the debt by the will of the dude in charge in the White House. We saw this on limits on bump stocks, on limits on other ways of tools of self-defense. Anyways, once the other branches have been marginalized enough for the executive to operate alone, the next step in the emergency script involves the militarization of the use of executive power. IRS, are we looking at you? And of course, I covered this as well in an episode and in a bunch of episodes, but one of my favorites on this particular topic, militarized federal agencies, the other standing army. Of course, we're seeing agencies like the IRS really arming up. Social Security Administration, I think 800,000, I don't know if it was rounds or all kinds of weaponry, high-powered weaponry. Health and Human Services, everything in between. This has created a de facto standing army, militarized federal agencies, just what we see in step 2 of the script. Number 3 is procedural shortcuts. And I think this ties into a lot of the executive orders as well. Kim writes, crises may be managed through executive or military orders rather than ordinary legislation. But these orders have the force of law. Well, maybe they do when they're supposedly allowed, or maybe they don't, but the people treat them that way anyway. And that's really the end result is how it plays out in practice. So if Congress passes a law and no one treats it that way because they think it's a violation of the Constitution or their liberty, whatever, that may be on the books, but it doesn't impact anyone. If the executive branch writes an executive order to ban a bump stock or a pistol brace or a lower third, for example. And everyone knows that that's not a law, but they still follow it anyways because they're afraid. Fear is the foundation of government power. Then it really does have the force of law based on how the market is treating it. So there are so many examples of this today. They say, Kim writes, property can be frozen, searched, seized, destroyed without legal process. Take the guns first, due process later. It might have heard that one. We can hear all kinds of examples, including the TSA in and of itself. That wasn't created by executive order, but that came out of the Patriot Act, warrantless surveillance. This wasn't necessarily an executive order, but I think it ties together with the militarization as well. Number 4 is putting people in their places. Man, I like how she put that. With formal procedure weakened, emergency governments then put people in their places. She said, perhaps the signature element of emergency governments is its reliance on administrative detention, but close behind. So they used indefinite or administrative detention to hold people, get them out of the way. But they also use a lot of other stuff. And anyone who's been alive the last few years, and especially if you've lived in a place like I did during that time, downtown Los Angeles in lockdown central, you saw this play out in intense ways. So the number one way the authoritarian governments use are administrative detention, but very close behind, she said, are curfews, restrictions on group meetings, and restriction of access to symbolic sites for protest. I mean, we certainly live that in almost complete detail. So that's number 4, putting people in their places. Number 5, inversion of speech protection. We're seeing this expand more and more every single year. She said, along with these measures, the legal regime that applies to speech is inverted. Man, some speech formerly protected is criminalized as a threat or reclassified as as action, for example, as sedition or incitement. And I've done a number of episodes talking about freedom of speech, and we saw this actually happen in the earliest days of the Republic, all the way back in 1798. John Adams, who was once one of the good guys, the Atlas of Independence, recognized that fear is the foundation of government power, most governments. Then, at the time, there was fear of foreign dangers, and he signed on to the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, which led to Thomas Jefferson and James Madison authoring the Kentucky and Virginia Resolution, supporting nullification and interposition, but that's a quick side note. So I did an episode on the Sedition Act of 1798, and here from the highlights. This is one of the most egregious violations of the Constitution in history, criminalizing free speech and the press just years after the First Amendment was ratified. So they just ratified the thing, and within 7 years, they've already attacked it. And James Madison, in a letter to Thomas Jefferson in the weeks leading up to passage of the Sedition Act, which was, I think, signed into law in July of 1798. This is May, just a couple months earlier. Madison said, perhaps it is a universal truth that the loss of liberty at home is to be charged to provisions against danger, real or pretended, from abroad. I really like highlighting where he said real or pretended. Madison recognized what we all recognize. When there's real danger abroad, people are willing to give up their liberty to get some kind of safety. And I know you guys know there's a Franklin quote on this. But then when there's no danger abroad, governments are willing to prey on the fear of the people, and still you get the same end result. So that's flipping freedom of speech upside down. The next one is actually 2, number 6 and 7, I think, tie together. Reversal of transparency and anticipatory violence. The best defense is a good offense, right? Not for government. I mean, what we want to do is get them out of the way as often as possible. It's such a dangerous beast. So Kim writes, at this point in the emergency script, the transparency that exists in public life is reversed. During crises, it becomes harder for citizens to see what government is doing because government is blanketed in secrecy. And Patrick Henry once warned, and I don't have the quote right here in front of me, but off the top of my head, he said, you can't be free if the transaction of the people in power can be kept secret from you. So as long as there are exercising these powers in secret Secret courts that rubber stamp mass warrantless surveillance. I mean, there's no secret court authorized in the Constitution, but it exists. There really is. I mean, it's a known secret. And anticipatory violence, she writes, eventually states that have taken many of these steps. Now, they don't all go in this exact order, but if you've already taken a bunch of these steps, they may turn to the deployment of anticipatory violence. They have or will soon attack us, claims the government. How many times have we heard this? We must attack them in response for what we see might happen. Full-blown emergencies in their later stages typically deploy violence against real or imagined opponents even before the threatened violence by others emerges. I'm sure you can come up with examples of how this is played out, whether there's a threat of violence and people back down or whether there has been actual violence, but I like how she mentioned real or imagined, just like James Madison said, real or pretended. So we may not be all the way there on number 6 and 7, but I think if not, we're not far off. Here, this is an overview from John Whitehead that I think ties in pretty interestingly, or pretty well. He said, just look at the mess we're in right now. Political theatrics that keep the populace distracted while the police state clamps down. An economy that is disintegrating before our eyes. A surveillance state that is gearing up for total control. An aging national infrastructure that is falling apart. An appalling lack of leaders with moral backbones and civil knowledge. And a government that grows more authoritarian with every passing day. I mean, that's a pretty good summary. He said the looming problem is not so much that the U.S. is being invaded by hostile forces at the border or anywhere, really, but rather that the Constitution is under assault from within by a power-hungry cabal at the highest levels of power. They want to keep us afraid of outsiders all the time, foreign dangers, this country, this country, this country. They're all out to get us because we're free, right? They hate us because we're free, and they're all going to kill us unless we allow the government to have additional power to protect us. And once we give them that emergency power, they never give it back. Here, back to Kim again, number 8. How do I say her last name? I keep looking back at my notes. I wrote it, spelled it, Kim Lane Shepla. This is just awesome research and writing that she's done here. She said, in the end, and I think this is the most important part, emergency powers often last well beyond the threat that called them into being. I would make the case they last forever. And that was what my episode that I cited at the beginning here today, emergency powers are forever, because once they have them, even when they stop using them, someone in the future will claim the power to do the same, and that will be their baseline of the emergency power, not the ceiling. So they last well beyond the threat that called them into being. It is not at all unusual, she writes, for laws promulgated during crises to become permanent as a government emerges from a crisis or to be redeployed. That's the version that I see most for the next crisis without ever having been repealed. And mind you, a lot of this stuff is by executive order, so there is no passage of law. There is no process, public debate on it. There is no repeal, no nothing. It's just whatever one person with power, the most powerful office on earth, one person gets to make that choice for hundreds of millions, if not the whole globe. So this is the nature of power. Once you give it up, it never goes back in the bottle, at least not voluntarily. And on top of it, they always try to expand it further and further and further. I've got a few warnings on this from some leading founders and old revolutionaries. George Mason, of course, told us that those who have power in their hands will not give it up while they can retain it. On the contrary, we know they will always, when they can, rather increase it. Or Samuel Adams with the pun of all ages, power is intoxicating. He was a brewer, right? Samuel Adams, power is intoxicating, and men legally vested with it too often discover a disposition to make an ill use of it and an unwillingness to part with it. And some people will tell me, oh, dude, you just had to do it for this one thing. They're just going for the terrorists. They're just trying to stop a disease. Whatever it may be, whatever anyone believes the government is going to protect them from, they're missing the point that once you give them the power to do something, even if you like it, they don't give it back, And that means you've set a precedent for them to do it again and someone else to do it on somebody else or in a different issue or use that power in ways that you never authorized them. And that's what Thomas Jefferson said. And I mentioned Hamilton and his First National Bank changing the word necessary to mean convenient. Jefferson argued against that vehemently. So did Edmund Randolph. So did James Madison. Unfortunately, it was signed into law. And, well, that set the precedent. And that's what Jefferson was talking about. So even if you like the emergency powers, if they aren't within the bounds of the Constitution, you are authorizing all kinds of crap for future generations. You shouldn't do that. Here's how Jefferson put it. Again, this is 1791, his arguments against his opinion against the constitutionality of the national bank. He said, to take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power no longer susceptible of any definition. And this is the kind of information that we work hard every single day to get out to more and more people. I think it's pretty essential stuff. It's not something we're not talking about emergency powers every day, but the limits of power, how you can't allow them to do stuff even when you like it. And then, of course, how to defend the Constitution and liberty when government refuses to do the job, which for us is constantly 24/7, 365. Nothing helps us get that work done more than the financial faith and support of our members. And while we're here, I do want to say a quick thank you. I really, really appreciate your support to a handful of people who just joined us as members recently. I saw a bunch of people out in the live chat that are members as well. I'm very grateful for you as well, but I don't want to dox anybody. So there's Susan in Iowa, Bill in South Carolina, Frank in Florida, John in California, Todd in Washington State, and Jennifer in Minnesota. I really appreciate your support. If you want to join them, you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please throw it our way. We will use it in support of the Constitution and liberty. $2 a month is where it starts over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. There are also annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. And I really appreciate any consideration you can give to joining us today. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational, more important than anything. I hope you learned something. I really appreciate you being here. And I will take a look over in the live chat a little bit later today and see if there's any comments or questions I can get back to, of course. Send me emails, whatever. I get lots of great ideas for future episodes from your feedback. Sometimes you're calling me out for getting something wrong or make me think about something in a different way, so I appreciate all that as well. And, of course, smashing the like button, leaving reviews, comments, reviews on podcast platform, Apple Podcasts, for example. All these things can help tell those platforms to show us to more people, so I appreciate you engaging with the show in as many ways as possible. Again, I appreciate you being here. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.